Today's lesson is going to be on domain and range. To write the domain and range of a relation or a function, there are three notations that we will use. The one that you should be most familiar with is the inequality notation. The new ones that we will be learning are called interval and set notation. So let's take a look at an example of each. So take a look at this graph over here. I have a graph of a line, and notice that we have arrows on both ends of this line, which means that this graph keeps on going infinitely to the left and infinitely to the right, and it also goes infinitely down and infinitely up. So in order to write the inequality notation for the domain, remember that domain always goes from the left to the right. So left, we have an arrow, so we're going to go to negative infinity on the left side. And then we put in our inequality symbols. We're doing domain. Remember that domain represents x. And then it's going infinitely to the right. So the domain represents all values of x for this graph from negative infinity to positive infinity, left to right. So looking at the range. Now when doing range, we're going from the lowest to the highest point. So it's going infinitely down. And we're talking about the y values. And infinitely up. So the range for this graph are all y values that range from negative infinity to positive infinity. So the y values are less than infinity and greater than negative infinity. Now, interval notation, using the same graph. With interval notation, we put the left for domain, the left value, comma, the right value. And since we can never get to infinity, we're going to use parentheses, which means that they're actually not included in the domain, because if you can't get there, then you can't include it as part of the domain. So anytime there's arrows, you're going to use parentheses. Range, in this case, it's going to be the same thing. Infinitely down for the lowest value, infinitely up for the highest value, and infinity will always get parentheses. Set notation. So set means what number set do these values belong to? And the number set that these, since we're including all numbers from negative infinity to positive infinity, the number set would be all real numbers. So x, the domain values, is going to be an element of all real numbers. And the range, y, is going to be an element of all real numbers as well. Okay, so now let's take a look at some other examples. I'm going to pause the video for a moment. Okay, welcome back. So now we're going to look at some other examples of graphs and how to write the domain and range for them. So starting off with inequality notation, remember that domain is left to right. So if we look for the farthest left point and we look for the x value, we see that the x value is -1, -2, -3, -4. Then we put our inequality symbols, x for domain. And then the farthest right point, we notice that there's an arrow going to the right. So that means we're going to go to infinity. Going to the range, we go lowest to highest. So that means we have to look for the y-coordinate, but in this case we have two arrows, one infinitely going down, one arrow going infinitely up. Now let's go back here to this point here. Since this is a closed dot, there's no arrow here, it's not an open dot, it's a closed dot, we want to include -4 in the domain. We want to include it, because we can actually count it as part of the graph. So we would use an equal part on the inequality. The infinity symbols never get an equal part. Okay, moving down to interval notation. Again, we use the same numbers here. The difference here is going to be that since we're including -4 in the domain, we're going to use a bracket instead of a parentheses. Remember, parentheses means we do not include it as part of the domain. So will the negative infinity and the infinity get a bracket? No. They will get a parentheses. And so for set notation, to do the domain, all these values are real numbers. So we are going to use x is an element of all real numbers. But since it does not go to negative infinity, we have to constrain the domain. So we're going to put a line afterwards, and this means such that in math. X is an element of all real numbers such that x is going to be greater than or equal to -4. And that would be your set notation. Range, lowest to highest, x is an element of all real numbers. No constraint here. All real numbers, lowest to highest. Okay, moving on to the next graph. Using interval notation, this graph, -1, -2, -3, -4 on the left, 1, 2, 3, +4 on the right. Now it's this, whoops, I went to interval notation. We want inequality notation. And that's a closed dot, so we're going to use an equal sign. That's an open dot, so that means it's not included, so that's going to be no equal sign. Range, now notice the lowest point is 0 on the y-axis. We have a closed dot, so we're going to include 0 as part of the range. And then the highest point is going to be, if you count on the y-axis, 1, 2, 3. And this is going to be a closed dot because it's a solid curve here, so it's included, so equal sign. Interval, remember we use the two numbers. It's included, it's not included. 0 to 3, included, included. Domain, again, we're going to be using all real numbers, but we do have a constraint, and we're going from -4 to +4, but not including +4. Range, we're going, and I just realized I messed up, so you guys are going to have to forgive me. Back up here at this graph, when I did range, I used an X, and you probably caught it because, you know, somebody did. But thankfully I caught it before we got too far. Range is Y. So range, Y is an element of all real numbers, double strike R, such that, and we're going from 0 to 3. Now on this last one here, this one, notice the dots are not connected. These graphs are continuous. The dots are all connected. Here they're not connected. So when they're not connected, we actually use a notation called roster notation. And so when you're doing roster notation and you're writing the domain, you're listing, okay, you're making a list of all the x values going from left to right. So this x value would be -3, -2, 0, 2, 5. And for the range, we're at -4, -1, 0, 1, 5. Now notice when I did the range, I looked at the y-axis to get the number. When I did the domain, I looked at the x-axis to get the number. Okay, thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you guys in class.